Hey guys, welcome to part number 6 of the 7 money milestones webinar. Part number 6. Again, this is 1 hour webinars broken down into parts. It's a long webinar with a lot of content that I had to cover, and I had to break it down into 1 hour webinar increments because I didn't want you guys to get boring. All right, so enjoy the music. We're gonna start in about 1 minute. Again, on the first part of this of the webinar, you probably scan the QR code and you have the webinar inside your cell phone. Remember, throughout the webinar, there's a lot of links that you have to go. And now, from now on, we're gonna go talk about the history of mortgage, how mortgage system works. For those people that want to buy a property, you have to qualify for a mortgage loan, right? And the key is to have a 720 credit score, not a 650. That way you have a 720 credit score and interest rate is 2% to 3% or 4%, right? That's the key. So let's get started. All right, let's get started, guys. Let's get started. What I want you to do is watch this video. Give it to God. Give it all to God. Because God is the one that brought you into this world. Give it to God. Watch the video. I don't know the...
Let's start in Matthew 6. Jesus is speaking. He said, I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you'll eat or drink, or about your body, what you'll wear. Who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? And why do you worry about clothes? Oh, you have little faith. So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. And then in Philippians 4, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Jesus said very plainly, very repetitively, do not worry. I'm of the opinion that if Jesus says not to do something, he has our best interest at heart. He's not being meddlesome. He's not trying to limit us. He's concerned about our well-being. And we've missed something. Something has eluded us. We have tolerated something in our lives, in our thoughts, in our emotions. We've tolerated something, allowed it to flourish, that in reality is destructive, that Jesus has said, don't do that.
That we are so twisted and tied up and melting down in our own worries and problems. And we forget that we have a heavenly Father right there saying, do you want my help? And we just got to say, I want your help, and trust that he can do what he needs to do. Let him do the work that needs to be done. Look, if you're counting on yourself to solve all of your problems, then of course you're worried and stressed out. It doesn't matter how strong or wise or capable, how charismatic you are. It doesn't matter how much wealth or influence you have. You are not designed to be able to take on everything and handle everything. You will have more problems come at you than what you are capable of handling. When you carry the responsibility of everything, then you have to do everything. You have to find the solutions. You have to choose the right direction. You have to power through problems. You have to plan for the future, make adjustments. And you have to do all of it at the speed of life. Yeah, you're stressed out. You're worried, of course. But God does not want you to do it on your own. He wants you to recognize that he is there to lead you, to walk you through, to guide you through every step of the way. And here's the deal. He doesn't want to just give you every resource that you need to get through your problems. He wants to be what you need in every situation.
It's amazing the problems that are solved the moment that you decide to trust God in everything. Because when you trust God, you don't have to try to figure anything out anymore. As you lean on Him, then you take the pressure off of yourself. Because you don't have to try to figure stuff out. You don't have to try to change things that you've already tried a million times to change, and the more you try to change them, the more frustrated it makes you. Because you can just finally say, well, God, I'm trusting you with this, and if you can't change it, then I guess it don't need to be changed. The only way you can learn to stop worrying and stop trying to figure things out, and stop being jealous of what other people have, and is I just honestly think that in addition to studying the Word, I think that we just have to try it our way long enough to finally just get worn out enough to just say, okay, God, I surrender. You know the beginning, you know the end, and everything in between. You know every flaw that I have, every fault that I have, you know every weakness that I have, as well as my strengths. I surrender.
So many times I've just said, God, I don't know what to do. God, I'm overwhelmed, or God, I'm in over my head. And, you know, I've said this many times, God, help, please. It doesn't have to be long. It doesn't have to be eloquent. I don't have to have the answers or the solutions. I just need to go to the one who does have the answers.
Hey, have you ever been on an emotional roller coaster? I mean, you're just up, you're down, you're this way. And you know what God says? I'll take care of that. You ever go to bed thinking about it? Wake up in the middle of the night thinking about it? In the morning you get up, you're thinking about it. Man, it has captured your thinking. God says, I'll take your emotion and your thinking through Christ Jesus.
1 Peter 5:7 says, cast all your cares on him because he cares for you. And what that means is that we take all of our problems and our worries and we choose to place it in God's hands and say, I trust that you will handle the outcome. Are you confident that you can take your problems and your worries and place it in God's hands and that He can handle everything?
Worry is the anticipation of the negative. In fact, there's a relationship between faith and worry. It's inverse. Faith diminishes as worry flourishes. Or as your faith flourishes, your worry will diminish. Worry is the negative expression of what faith in God is. One of them would be, I don't want Jesus to ever look at me and use my name and person of little faith in the same sentence. Do you? I want to be a man of faith. Worry is saying, I don't think God can handle this, so I'm going to pick it up and I'm going to invest emotional energy in my thoughts and my anxiety. I'm not going to change the outcome a bit. Jesus said, you can't add 1 hour to your life. God can add years.
God has the best solution for all of our problems. He sees and knows everything. He sees the future. He understands every angle of what is going on in your life right now. He understands how people are viewing it and perceiving it. He sees the best solution to your problems. He's incredibly wise. When I worry, I am basically saying I am afraid that my life is not going to be the way that I want it to. But when I trust that God has the best solution, I am saying, God, I believe that you have the best way for me, even if it's not the path that I chose or that I came up with. And we can trust that if we follow God and if we trust Him, He will give us every resource that we need every step of the way. And that at the end, He can turn that into something wonderful and beautiful. And let me tell you, if you have someone who loves you enough and who is strong enough and who has the best solution, what do you have to worry about?
See, the reason that worry exists so often is because we just think it's normal. It's not normal. It's common, but it's not normal. It doesn't have to be in our life. And it's robbing us of God. It's robbing us of our family. It distracts me from God and people. It robs me of my joy. And it exists because I allow it to exist. Listen to what I'm saying. Worry exists and anxiety exists because we allow it. We are in complete control of our lives. God would never command us to do something that we don't have the ability to do.
Worry is a choice, and trust is a choice. You can't do both at the same time. You have to choose, put your trust in God, put the full weight of your problems and your life and your future into His hands and let Him carry it.
Worry and anxiety means the devil has implanted something in your life that's just sitting there intimidating you. And because of that, you can't focus on God and the people that you love. And that's the greatest problem with worry and anxiety. It robs you of your ability to worship, to love the people that you love. So it's an enemy. The root of all fear, worry, and anxiety is an orphan spirit, because orphans are on their own and they have to take care of their own problems. And the devil wants you to feel as though that you're on your own and you have to solve your own problems. You have the best father in the universe. Stop grieving over the father you didn't have and start rejoicing that you have the best father in the universe. And he loves helping you process anything in your life. Nothing is too small, nothing is too large. He just enjoys the ride. He just enjoys the relationship. And as we're sitting here obsessing about something, what it means is we're wasting the relationship.
He does see your problems and He wants to help you. God's love for you is so immense, and that means that you can come to Him with anything and everything.
We don't have to lead lives that are defined by worry, anxiety, and fear. Doesn't mean those things won't come, and they may even come with justification. But Jesus said we don't have to worry about them.
He is my provider. He is my protector. He is my promoter. He is the person that I long for in every relationship. He is the place that I look to find home. He is my professor to reveal beautiful new things to me. He is everything that I need and everything that I long for when I go to Him. The key to peace is not being able to solve every problem. The key to peace is resting in who God is. When we give God control, there's a beautiful promise that He will never leave or forsake you. Man, we can walk in that path, in that promise towards peace. He doesn't want you to be overwhelmed with worry and problems. He wants you to be overwhelmed with His love for you. And you may be saying, look, you don't understand how many problems I have. How many issues and how much I've gone through. Well, you know what? God says, no matter what you have, I want to take all of your problems, all of your worries, all of your failures, all of your sin, all of your brokenness, give it to me because I can handle it. And the truth is, only I can handle it.
All right, guys. So let's continue. So give yourself to God, guys. Give yourself to God. Be grateful. No regrets. Let's continue.
Let's start in Matthew.
So let's get started. Topic: mortgage. Let's talk about mortgage. What is mortgage? What is mortgage, guys? Let's talk about it. What is mortgage all about? Sorry about the technical difficulty, guys. This computer's acting up, but I have to get this done just for you. Because you definitely have to know what is a mortgage before you buy a house. So, right now, I'm looking for the section, what is mortgage? So let it upload here. So you can see I'm interactive, I'm live, and I'm looking for the section of what is a mortgage. What are the ins and outs of a mortgage for those people that want to buy a house to invest on or to live on? What is a mortgage? All right, let's get started. What is a mortgage? What I want you to do is watch this video. The history of mortgage.
Real estate is the best way to make money and the quickest way to lose money. At least that's what they say. In reality, the property industry has its ups and downs just like any other market. But what makes it stand out from the crowd is its longevity. But it wasn't always the case that you could buy and sell land. Even before you could slap a price tag on it, the earth under your feet had political sway and power which could affect the course of history. So how did real estate go from being owned by elites to being owned by the public and elites? Part 1. Early foundations. For most of human history, the ground was just dirt and mud. Then someone got the idea to build a straw hut, and hey, presto, real estate was invented. Or at least, a state. The idea of private property took a while to form. It took so long that humans learned to domesticate dogs 800 or so years before permanent structures were erected. Even before we conceptualized how to buy a home, we wanted a pet to live with. But once we figured out how to stop stuff falling over, we were set on figuring out how to integrate buildings into society. The oldest known establishment was Jericho in 9000 BC. It's fair to say any concept of property laws would be part of their customs or laws, though archaeologists are confident from their findings that early city-states often had communal aspects and land resource management. This suggests that humans' first focus was on building homes, municipal areas, infrastructure, and of course, palaces. That's because the king or queen or pharaoh or sultan or whoever was in charge owned everything. For most of human history, property rights have been firmly in the hands of the elite. Take ancient Greece. Their concept of property rights was not universal. Only free male adults could own or inherit land, which means women and slaves were out of the game. They were also closely tied to citizenship or social status. So if you think you'll get on the property ladder, spare a thought for the red tape Aristotle had to cut through. But over in Rome, things were different. There, property law was a significant part of the Roman legal system. For their time, it was immensely sophisticated, and has even provided the backbone for a lot of Western law. One monumental idea was to differentiate types of property. Dominium meant you owned the property, and possession meant you owned a bit of it, but you could own all of it one day if certain conditions were met. So in essence, these were the ancient world's equivalent of a mortgage. In Egypt, however, land ownership was stricter. Only the pharaoh or upper echelons of society could get a nice little place out by the Sphinx. Things weren't as comfortable for the masses. Any farmer toiling in a field they didn't own or wasn't owned by their boss had to pay a fee for the luxury to work. Damn. Even before property rights were universal, there were landlords and rent. It would take some time before the value of land changed, but when it did, the world was never the same again. So it's time to learn how history works as we chronicle the history of real estate. This week's video is sponsored by Trade Coffee. As fans of history, you should absolutely be getting your coffee from around the world. Trade Coffee makes coffee exciting, connecting me with over 450 coffees from over 55 local roasters, including dark roasts, espressos, blends, and rare roasts. Their matching algorithm curates the perfect coffee match for you based on your taste preferences, and surprises you with a new variety every time. For example, it knows what I like and matched me with Methodical's Brazil Signature Series. It's rich, full-bodied, with subtle hints of chocolate and nuts, perfect for what I like. I used to drink coffee just as a way to get me going, but when I started tasting good coffee with Trade, I realized that you really shouldn't sacrifice taste just for energy, and I'm never going back to that disgusting old coffee. Fresh coffee is better coffee, and the coffee will always be shipped within 48 hours of being roasted. Get a free bag of coffee with select subscription plans by going to drinktrade.com/howhistoryworks. With free shipping, customizable plans, and anytime cancellation, Trade is making it easier to discover better coffee. Part 2. Common ground and private property. For the longest time, land was just where your home happened to be. The power you had ended as soon as you left your village. That changed in 1066, when William the Conqueror successfully overtook England following his victory at the Battle of Hastings. Once he kicked King Harold off the throne, he was free to claim England as his own. But installing stability following the Normandy invasion required a cunning move. First, he commissioned the Domesday Book. Initially, it was simply called the Book of Winchester. But by the 12th century, it got its ominous-sounding name because the survey of land ownership was seen to hold as much judgment as the end times. But this record was vital to the paradigm shift which William the Conqueror was about to unleash. He divvied up the land and offered it to his Norman allies, so long as they swore fealty to him. In essence, land is gifted in exchange for military support or resources, all the things a king needs to keep his domain running smoothly. In turn, those allies divvied up their land to people below them, which created a hierarchy of ownership with more tiers and conditions that had ever existed before. As you can imagine, this structure changed society irrevocably. Now was the time of the feudal system. Admittedly, some forms of feudal systems had existed before, such as the Zhou dynasty in China. From 1046 to 256 BC, land was also granted in return for military. However, there are plenty of differences with the European model. For example, in Europe, the power was centralized, whereas in China, the relationship between nobles and peasants were different thanks to Confucian ideas of moral obligations like welfare for others. But at the risk of going off topic, the point is historians agree that William the Conqueror was the first to install real feudalism, all thanks to his radical approach to land ownership. Up until that moment, landowning was still an elite pastime, or at best, a sort of quid pro quo deal. So, although the Chinese beta tested feudalism, it was the new King of England's utilization of land's power that the concept of real estate started to evolve. In the centuries that followed, other parts of the world adopted this stellar new form of governance, like Japan and the Middle East. Yet the land was not owned in the sense that we understand it. There was no court for you to contest your rights. Instead, you more or less operated on a premise with the ruler. If you got on their bad side, you'd be kicked out or executed. After all, real estate is a cutthroat business. In the case of William the Conqueror, the king parceled land to the highest lords, who parceled their land down to lesser lords and knights, and so on and so on. Peasants, who were most of the population, worked on lands owned by their lords in return for protection, food, and well, that was pretty much it. Lives were spent toiling in fields owned by someone else. Can you imagine spending all your time and energy making money for someone else only to die and have nothing? How times have changed. Speaking of changing times, the public eventually came to be able to own property. That's because after centuries of the feudal system, give or take a few refinements to law, a revolution was coming that would open up property to the masses. Part 3. Trading territories. The Enclosure Acts in England were a series of pivotal reforms that began in 1604 and continued all the way into the 1900s. It marked the transition from collective rights of land ownership to individual rights of land ownership. You might be wondering why it took so long to put real estate in the hands of every man if property rights were already allocated to groups. So it's worth remembering that throughout the Middle Ages, life was communal. Medieval traditions kept things rural. You were born, raised, and eventually died on the farm you grew up on. In the remote village, your family roots started in however many decades or centuries before. There was no leaving the hometown to find yourself. That's an individualist worldview. Anyone thinking that a serf might have some innate worth on the same level as a heavenly appointed monarch was simply mad. And frankly, the move to a society that viewed people as groups rather than simply the king and everyone else was a pretty radical idea. That changed with the Enclosure Acts. Before these acts were passed, land was categorized into common and waste. Common was under the control of a lord, which gave him rights for farming and grazing animals. Waste was for parts of narrow land, usually in awkward places. Think of cliff edges, bare rock, and inconveniently shaped bordered off fields. These sucky lots weren't usually used by anyone, so landless peasants farmed on them. But conceptualizing land like this was a big step for real estate, because it meant that types of land had different value. That's why the enclosure legislation was rolled out over the following centuries, to make it easier to understand which land was good for agriculture, productivity, and consolidation. By dividing and redistributing common lands, each lord or knight could fence areas off. It was during this time that people got specific about precisely what they owned. It was no longer a vague, I own all the grass over there, but more specific, I own 28 square miles of up-and-coming real estate. So what gives? Why did people suddenly decide to take out the measuring tape? It's because of the transition to the agricultural revolution. As technology slowly improved and populations expanded and empires consolidated, people started number crunching. In the same way that the Industrial Revolution changed how we live, so too did the Agricultural Revolution upend our ancestors' way of life. However, there was a detrimental effect on the poor. The loss of rights to common land caused widespread displacement and poverty. I guess this was the medieval version of gentrification, but instead of condominiums and Starbucks, it was a fenced field with cows in it. The knock-on effect was people moving to cities for work, which spurred on urbanization or banding together elsewhere. So, though humans have more or less always congregated around city walls or the countryside, these huge consequences put these forms of habitation into overdrive. In effect, they created suburbs and towns, where before it had been cities and villages. To us modern folk in megacities, upgrading to a town or suburb might not seem like a big deal. But remember that these effectively created two new types of residencies. The knock-on effect was markets replacing a reliance on shared resources, which galvanized city growth but killed off hamlets and settlements. In these areas, people could start to live their own lives. They started to have a say over what they did, what they produced, what they sold, and what they bought. Yet, these acts did more than lay the groundwork for our modern landscape. It created a market for private property rights. Now, land was a commodity that could be bought or sold like all other goods. Part 4. Closing the deal. With the emergence of a real estate market, post-Enclosure Act England, as well as other parts of Europe, built legal frameworks to facilitate the owning, buying, and transferring of land through the legal system. Protections included transparency, security, and smoother administrative processes. Everything a buyer or seller needs for confidence. Over time, the system evolved from a humble registry to more comprehensive databases, which included details about a property's ownership history, value, and any other encumbrances. Bit by bit, data was being collected to envision a real estate market so that buyers and sellers could become acquainted with rates. That means rulers had another way to measure their GDP. Now the stage was set to fuel exploration, set up colonies, and trade territories, either for profit, peace, or both. One of history's biggest real estate deals was none other than the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. To cut a long story short, Britain, France, and Spain had been jockeying for a strategic slice of the North American continent for quite some time. But shortly after the French monarchy helped British colonies gain independence, the French public got rid of the royal family. Eventually, the new country of America found itself in an interesting position when Napoleon eventually became the new ruler. Napoleon didn't care about America's friendship with the old France, but he cared about defeating the British once and for all. So, in pursuit of funding an army to take down the crown, he sold off that prized piece of real estate for a bargain price of $15 million. By today's standards, some economists estimate it to be around $2.2 trillion. Some people flip houses. Napoleon flips territories. Unfortunately for Mr. Bonaparte, the deal was a bad idea because he lost the war against the British anyway. As for the US, the deal doubled their country's size and has more than made back its money. And as the world progressed further into the 19th century and beyond, the influence of real estate continued to grow. Home ownership became such a staple of modern life that current generations feel they are missing something if they don't have an asset like their folks. Of course, their parents had it easier buying a house because of the post-war home owning booms and the emergence of mortgage systems. In America, the Federal Housing Administration and Federal National Mortgage Association standardized and insured loans to mitigate risks to lenders and buyers. As painful as having middlemen can be, there's no question that these ideas revolutionized property rights even more. By the dawn of the 20th century, the power of real estate was understood on every level. And by level, I also mean multi-story buildings. Because as long as it took humans to conceptualize the value of width of a plot of land, they were relatively quicker to calculate the value of its height. Part 5. Sky-high speculation. Skyscrapers are commonplace because it's cheaper to build up than across. No doubt, our ancestors' heads would explode if they saw the towering constructions we take for granted. Think about it. Ancient Greeks were impressed by the height of the Pantheon. The Romans were proud of the stature of the Colosseum. And medieval peasants were in awe of the looming cathedrals of Europe. But nowadays, going higher than most of humankind ever did is just part and parcel of our way of life. If you are on the 5th floor of an apartment building, or even if your home has stairs, you are at altitudes which seemed impossible to the centuries of people before us. Of course, these daring buildings are the consequences of a competitive real estate market. Before, buying and selling was based around farming lands and individual homes. Over the last few hundred years emerged the concept of commercial space, where real estate is sold to businesses, universities, airports, and anything else you can think of. No matter what building you see, it's owned by someone, somewhere. Even those empty London high-rises are purchased by a Russian oligarch living in Monaco. So, as metropolises expand in every direction, and commercial development of malls, stadiums, and highways increased, it was only a matter of time until something went wrong. Now, you don't need me to tell you that housing markets have bubbles, just like any other industry. And you don't need me to read off the name of those disasters. Choose any decade, country, or continent, and you'll find the survivor stories of a bust. Just know that as property rights have been refined with zoning laws and protections for landlords and tenants, so too have investors gambled with the value of what land could be. Speculation drives a lot of real estate markets, which means that now people can buy and sell land not on what it's worth now, but what it could be worth in the future. That leaves the market susceptible to foreign influence and market fluctuations. It's a tragic indictment that in our era, it's easier to get a home, but also easier to lose one. But what's even more astonishing is what's coming down the pipeline. Plenty of people are speculating that the next property revolution is digital real estate. Not in the sense of domain names, though the act of buying up web addresses to sell later on does smack of flipping homes, but in the sense of where you could visit. If VR and the metaverse do eventually become more viable, expect to be taking out real mortgages for virtual land. Tempting as it may be to brush off Mark Zuckerberg's underwhelming computer worlds, Minecraft servers still sell for a hefty price. Even Roblox has its own in-game economy, where digital users take digital products to a digital market to trade real money. If that sounds far-fetched, consider how the threat of net neutrality would alter our perception of common internet usage, in the same way that the Enclosure Acts redefine land rights and privileges for groups and individuals. Perhaps in your lifetime, virtual reality worlds will get their own version of the Doomsday Book. Maybe Amazon or WeChat will do the internet equivalent of the Louisiana Purchase. Or maybe this is all a trend that will die off faster than MySpace. Then again, maybe the next real estate boom is in colonizing moons and constructing space stations. NASA is hoping to build lunar homes by 2040. Surely the mortgage rates will be astronomical. If sticking a fence in a field altered the trajectory of mankind, who knows what's in store for use when we can cordon off sectors of interstellar space. One thing is for certain, whether it's off-world or online, there's no commodity more capable of changing society than real estate. Which do you think will happen first? Virtual reality land or outer space property? State your argument in the comment section below. Real estate has built empires. In fact, so much so that the world's oldest company is a real estate construction conglomerate that has lasted over 1,000 years. To find out how you can make a company to last so long, go and watch our video on the history of Congo Gumi. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.
Well, there you go, guys. That's the history of mortgage. There's another video, but is the in the assignment section for you guys. Again, for those that tune in day one to part one of my 7 milestone webinar, you're going to have the entire webinar on your cell phone if you scan the QR code that you see in the beginning of part one of the webinar. All right. So now what I want you guys to do is watch what the banking system is all about.
Real estate is
Watch what the banking system is all about, guys. This video is gonna blow your mind.
You are about to learn one of the biggest secrets in the history of the world. It's a secret that has huge effects for everyone who lives on this planet. Most people can feel deep down that something isn't quite right with the world economy, but few know what it is. Gone are the days where a family can survive on just one paycheck. Every day it seems things are more and more out of control, yet only 1 in a million understand why. You are about to discover the system that is ultimately responsible for most of the inequality in our world today. The powers that be do not want you to know about this, as this system is what has kept them at the top of the financial food chain for the last 100 years. Learning this will change your life because it'll change the choices that you make. If enough people learn it, it'll change the world because it'll change the system. For this is the biggest hidden secret of money. Never in human history have so many been plundered by so few, and it's all accomplished through this, the biggest scam in the history of mankind.
They say that money doesn't grow on trees, but the truth is that the modern banking system creates currency far faster than trees can grow. Most people don't have a clue how currency is created. Economists and bankers make it sound so complex that people think they can't understand it. But I'm going to strip our monetary system down to its essence so that you can see the scam behind the curtain and just how it affects you. Every modern society creates currency in pretty much the same way. But since the US dollar is the majority of the world's currency, I'm going to use the United States as our example. It all starts when some politician says, "Vote for me and I'll make sure the government provides you more free stuff than my opponent will." But there's no such thing as a free lunch. So to provide that supposedly free stuff, the politicians vote for the country to spend more than its income. This is called deficit spending. To pay for that deficit spending, the Treasury borrows currency by issuing a bond. So what's a bond? If you think about it, a bond is really nothing but a glorified IOU. It's a pretty piece of paper with numbers printed on it that says, "Loan me $1 trillion today, and I promise over a 10-year period I'm going to pay you back that $1 trillion plus interest." But what you need to understand is that Treasury bonds are our national debt. These glorified IOUs are to be paid back by you and I and our descendants through future taxation. Therefore, when the government issues a bond, it steals prosperity out of the future so that it can spend it today. The Treasury then holds a bond auction, and the world's largest banks show up and compete to buy part of our national debt and make a profit on it by earning interest. You'll notice that as we move through this process, the big banks are there, taking a cut every step of the way. This isn't by chance, as you'll see shortly. Then, through a shell game called open market operations, the banks get to sell some of those bonds to the Federal Reserve at a profit. To pay for the bonds, the Federal Reserve opens up its big old checkbook and writes bad, bogus, counterfeit checks that should bounce because they're drawn on an account that always has a zero balance. There isn't 1 penny in there. To quote from the Boston Federal Reserve, "When you or I write a check, there must be sufficient funds in our account to cover that check. But when the Federal Reserve writes a check, there is no bank deposit on which that check is drawn. When the Federal Reserve writes a check, it is creating money." The Fed then hands those checks to the banks, and at this point, currency springs into existence. The banks then take that currency and buy more bonds at the next Treasury auction. But what is a check? A check is also an IOU. When you write a check, you're making a note that says, "Here's my IOU for cash. All you have to do is go to the bank and pick it up."
Now, it's very, very important that you understand this process because we're going to come back later and show you the devastating effect this has on you. The Treasury issues IOUs, bonds. The banks then buy those IOUs with currency. The Federal Reserve then writes IOUs, checks, and hands them to the banks in exchange for the Treasury's IOUs, the bonds. And currency is created. So what's really happening is the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are just swapping IOUs, using the banks as middlemen, and abracadabra, presto, currency magically springs into existence. This process repeats and repeats over and over again, enriching the banks and indebting the public by raising the national debt. The end result is that there's a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury. This process is also where all paper currency comes from. The Federal Reserve and the government mistakenly call it base money because they didn't watch episode 1 of this series and they don't know the difference between money and currency. But I will correctly refer to it as base currency because it is not money. It is currency, and as we've learned, there is a big difference. Money has to be a store of value and maintain its purchasing power over long periods of time. We learned in episode 1 that earlier in our history, our paper currency was just a claim check. It was a representation for real money of intrinsic value, the gold and silver that was held on deposit at the Treasury. You could walk into any bank and slap your currency, like say a $20 bill, on the counter and redeem it for real money, a $20 gold piece. But now, this base currency that's piling up back here is really nothing but a receipt or a claim check on an IOU, that bond. So it's really nothing but a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the newly created currency into the various branches of the government, and the politicians say, hey, thanks for that. And the government does some deficit spending on public works, social programs, and war. The government employees, contractors, and soldiers then deposit their pay in the banks. Now, this may come as a shock to you, but when you deposit your currency with the bank, you're not actually depositing it into an account to be safely held in trust for you. Instead, you're actually loaning the bank your currency, and within certain legal limits, they can do with it pretty much anything they please. This includes gambling in the stock market and loaning it out, at a profit, of course. Now this is where the machine of currency creation really gets cranking, because this is where something called fractional reserve lending comes into play. Fractional reserve lending is exactly what it says. The banks are allowed to reserve only a fraction of your deposit and loan the rest out. Although reserve ratios may vary, I'm going to use a 10% reserve ratio as our example. If you deposit $100 in your account, the bank can legally take $90 of it and loan it out without telling you. The bank must hold $10 of your deposit in reserve just in case you want some of it. These reserves are called vault cash. But why does your bank account still say you have $100 if the bank has stolen $90 of it? Because the bank left IOUs it created called bank credit in its place. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but here it is in black and white from the Fed. Commercial banks create checkbook money when they grant a loan simply by adding new deposit dollars in accounts on their books in exchange for a borrower's IOU. These are nothing but numbers that the banks type into their computers. And even though these bank credit IOU numbers are very different from base currency numbers, because they only exist in computers, they are still currency. So now there is $190 in existence. Now, the reason people take out loans from the banks is to buy something. They're going to buy a house or a car or something like that. So the borrower takes the $90 that the bank loaned to him from your account, and he pays the seller of the item. But then the seller deposits that currency into his account, and his bank loans out 90% of that and leaves bank credit numbers in its place. So now there's $271 in existence. This process repeats and repeats until under a 10% reserve ratio, an initial deposit of just $100 can create up to $1,000 of bank credit, all backed by $100 of vault cash, just 10%. But as I said, reserve ratios vary wildly. On some deposits, it's 10%. On others, it's 3%. And on some forms of deposits, reserve requirements are 0. The result is that the expansion of the currency supply by the banks is far greater than even this example would lead you to believe. So once again, when currency is deposited in the banks get to lend it out, and then it gets redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent, redeposited and relent over and over again, creating bank credit all the way. This is where the vast majority of our currency supply comes from. In fact, 92 to 96% of all currency in existence is created not by the government, but here in the banking system. Now, massive amounts of currency spewing into society may at first sound like a fun idea. That is, until you remember one of the most important hidden secrets of money from episode 1, that the prices of everyday goods and services act as a sponge on an expanding currency supply. The more currency we have, the more prices rise. This is where inflation comes from. The true definition of inflation is an expansion of the currency supply. Rising prices are merely the symptom. So our entire currency supply is nothing but a couple of bucks whipped up in this hocus-pocus scam where the Treasury and the Federal Reserve swap glorified IOUs, and a bunch of numbers that the banks just type into their computers. That's it. That's our entire currency supply. It's nothing but a supply of numbers. Some of them printed, most of them typed, and there is nothing else. But if you thought that was crazy, get ready to enter the twilight zone of modern economics. We work for some of that currency supply. True wealth is your time, but we trade away moments of our lives, hour by hour, day by day, and year by year, for numbers that somebody printed on pieces of paper or just typed into a computer. Now those numbers represent our blood, sweat, tears, labor, ideas, and talent. We are what gives the currency its value.
Listen to this video, guys.
But here comes the really cruel joke. We work hard so that we can save some of that currency, so that we can pay the tax collector. In the United States, it's known as the IRS. They then turn it over to the Treasury so that the Treasury can pay the principal plus interest on that bond that the Federal Reserve bought with a check
our money
on an account that has
circulated
nothing in
single
it.
day and time to make
Now let's
money.
do a recap on this section,
On the
because
facts.
this is where the system begins to rob you and I on a massive scale.
They get more money than
Much
what
of
we
our
do.
taxes are not used
They
for
pay taxes.
schools, roads, and public services,
ECON
but to
Learning
pay
Center
interest
pays
on bonds
to
that the
combat
Federal Reserve bought with a check drawn on an account
Actually,
that has nothing in it. The Federal Reserve is committing fraud. But here's one of the biggest secrets of them all. Before the establishment of the Federal Reserve, there was no need for personal income tax. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and that very same year, the Constitution was amended to allow income tax. Do you really think this was just a coincidence? Ask yourself how much income tax you've paid over your lifetime. Much of it has been silently siphoned away into the hands of those who own the system. Yes, this system has owners. Who they are is an even bigger secret that we'll get to shortly. But first, we need to understand the mumbo-jumbo of the so-called debt ceiling. It's all based on a huge paradox. There was interest due on that bond, and there was interest due on every one of those loans that the banks made. That means that there is interest due on every dollar in existence. Let me ask you something. If you borrow the very first dollar into existence, and that's the only dollar that exists on the planet, but you promise to pay it back plus another dollar's worth of interest, where do you get the second dollar to pay the interest? The answer is that you have to borrow that one into existence and promise to pay it back with interest as well. So now there are $2 in existence, but you owe $4, and so on and so on. The result is there's never enough currency to pay the debt. There is always more debt in the system than there is currency in existence to pay the debt. Therefore, the whole system is impossible. It is finite. It will come to an end one day. What would happen if the government stopped borrowing to do deficit spending? Are the payments on those treasury bonds going to stop? What would happen if the public stopped borrowing and going deeper into debt? Are your house and car payments going to stop? No. There is a payment due every month on the principal plus the interest on every dollar in existence, and those payments do not stop. If we stop borrowing, then no new currency is created to replace the currency that we used to make those payments. Whether you're making a payment on a loan or paying tax to make a payment on a bond, the portion of the payment that goes to pay off the principal extinguishes that portion of the debt. But the debt also extinguishes the currency. Currency and debt are like matter and antimatter. When they meet, they annihilate each other. If we just pay off the principal only on all the loans and bonds that exist, the entire currency supply just vanishes. So if we don't go deeper into debt every year, look what happens. The whole thing goes into a deflationary collapse under the weight of those payments. Politicians and pundits alike talk about balancing the budget, paying down the debt, and living within our means. They don't understand that that is deflationary. It is impossible to do under our current monetary system without collapsing the whole economy. This is why any talk of a debt ceiling is not only ridiculous, it's delusional. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt just to continue. And that's why politicians will always kick the can down the road and raise this so-called debt ceiling over and over again until the whole system finally collapses under its own weight. In other words, they don't want it to collapse on their watch. The founding fathers of the United States knew the dangers of central banking and fought to free themselves from this very thing. The Revolutionary War started out as a tax revolt, but now we must pay tax just to have a monetary system. Having just suffered through the hyperinflation of the continental dollar, which was printed into oblivion to finance the Revolutionary War, they understood the dangers of fiat currency and debt-based monetary systems. So to protect future generations from institutional theft and out-of-control government, they wrote into the Constitution that only gold and silver can be money for the simple fact that you can't print them. Our current system is not only unconstitutional, but it robs us of the liberty and prosperity our forefathers fought and died for. We are all feeling the effects of ignoring the Constitution right now. By forcing more currency into circulation, our purchasing power is diluted. Inflation is a slow and insidious stealth tax that is simply the result of this debt-based monetary system. This system empowers and benefits those who create the currency and receive it first, as they get to spend it into circulation before it has an effect on the economy. They're stealing purchasing power from you and transferring it to the banks and the government every hour of every day because of this false monetary system. And it's not like the people at the top don't know this. To quote the Federal Reserve, the decrease in purchasing power incurred by the holders of money due to inflation imparts gains to the issuers of money. This is a fraud. It is a pyramid scheme, it is a Ponzi scheme, it's a scam, and it's a lie. Our entire monetary system is nothing but a form of legalized theft. But here's the biggest con job of them all. The Federal Reserve is not federal. It has stockholders. There is no federal agency that has stockholders. What's a stockholder? A share of stock represents a percentage of ownership in a corporation. So the stockholders are the owners of that corporation. Therefore, the Federal Reserve is a private corporation with owners. And you can see it for yourself if you go to the Federal Reserve's website, and it will say, the stockholders receive an annual dividend of 6%. Now, we know that the stock in the Federal Reserve was originally issued to the largest banks in the United States. But because of mergers and acquisitions through the years, you can't actually trace who owns the stock in the Federal Reserve. That's a very closely guarded secret. My guess would be that the owners are those primary dealers, the banks that get to make a profit by selling part of our national debt, those bonds, to the Federal Reserve, who buys them with a check from nothing. Then we pay tax to pay the principal and the interest on those bonds so that the Federal Reserve can pay the banks a 6% dividend. Don't be alarmed if you don't quite comprehend the deception of this system at first glance. Very few people do. It is purposely complex. The economist John Maynard Keynes once wrote, "By this means, government may secretly and unobserved confiscate the wealth of the people, and not one man in a million will detect the theft." I believe that presented correctly, anyone can understand this system, regardless of how complex it is. So let's do a recap and break it down even more. The way the system works is that Step 1. The government creates glorified IOUs. These bonds increase our national debt and put the public on the hook to pay it back. Step 2. IOUs are swapped to create currency. The Treasury sells the bonds to the banks. The banks then turn around and sell our national debt at a profit to the Federal Reserve, which they probably own. The Federal Reserve then opens its checkbook that doesn't have a penny in it and buys those IOUs with IOUs that it writes, checks, on a checking account that has a zero balance. Then they give those checks to the banks and currency just springs into existence. And then the whole process repeats. This results in a buildup of bonds at the Federal Reserve and currency at the Treasury, which is really just a supply of numbers. The Treasury then deposits the numbers in the various branches of the government, and we get to step 3. The government spends the numbers on promises, public works, social programs, and war. Then the government employees, contractors, and soldiers deposit their pay into the banks, and we get to step 4, where the banks multiply the numbers by magically inventing more IOUs through fractional reserve lending, where they steal a portion of everyone's deposit and lend it out. That currency gets redeposited, and then a portion is stolen again. And the process repeats over and over, magnifying the currency supply exponentially. Then we work for some of those numbers, which brings us to step 5, where our numbers are taxed. We pay tax to the IRS, who then turns our numbers over to the Treasury, so the Treasury can pay the principal plus the interest on bonds that were purchased by the Federal Reserve with a check from nothing. Then we get to step 6, the debt ceiling delusion. The system is designed to require ever-increasing levels of debt and will eventually collapse under its own weight because politicians always kick the can down the road. They don't want it to collapse on their watch. And finally, step 7, the secret owners take their cut. The world's largest banks own the Federal Reserve. Those banks make a profit selling our national debt to the Fed. They make a profit when the Fed pays them interest on the reserves held at the Fed, and the Fed pays them a 6% dividend on their ownership of the Fed. This system is fundamentally evil. It funnels wealth from the working population to the government and the banking sector. It is the cause of the artificial booms and busts of modern economies, and it causes great disparity of wealth between the rich and the working class. And it is only possible because we no longer use real money, we use currency. But worst of all, it is a form of enslavement. Bond is the root word of bondage. Whenever a government issues a bond, it is a promise to make us pay tax in the future. Nobody asked you if you wanted to pay tax today for the prosperity we all enjoyed in the last century. Nobody is asking our children if they want to work hard in the future to pay for the prosperity we're enjoying now. George Washington once wrote to James Madison, "No generation has the right to contract debts greater than can be paid off during the course of its own existence." By stealing prosperity from tomorrow so we can spend it today, we enslave ourselves and future generations. Now, this all sounds pretty bad, but there is great hope, for you are the greatest threat to this false monetary system. This system relies on the public being ignorant of its workings. Please share this knowledge with everyone you know, because an informed public that fully understands the system can build a better future for generations to come. And now I leave you with this quote, widely attributed to a former director of the Bank of England. The modern banking system manufactures money out of nothing. The process is perhaps the most astounding piece of sleight of hand that was ever invented. Banking was conceived in inequity and born in sin. Bankers own the earth. Take it away from them, but leave them the power to create money and control credit, and with the flick of a pen, they will create enough money to buy it back again. But if you want to continue as the slaves of bankers and pay the cost of your own slavery, let them continue to create money and to control credit. This is the Federal Reserve in Washington, D.C. It's located on Constitution Street, and that is just as much of a joke as the New York Fed being located on Liberty Street. Both of them are unconstitutional, both of them limit our liberty, and they transfer wealth away from us every second of every day to the Federal Reserve, to the government, and to the banking sector. You are now among the 1 in a million who can detect the theft of your prosperity. So the big question is, what can you do about it? 1.